Hi, my name's Lisa Graustein, and I'm here with,
Melody Brazo.
and we're two Quakers in New England who are doing some short conversations about what it means to be white, racial justice, and the work before us right now. We've gotten a bunch of questions sent in from you, which we're really excited to have. And so I'm going to, Melody, just read you one of the questions, and I'd love to hear your answer. So one of the questions someone gave us is, how do I, as a white person, weigh my horror and anguish about racial injustice and my horror and anguish about the state of our country against my need for a balanced life? I don't want to retreat into my privilege, but I also need to take care of myself.
That is such an important question, and one that I have not only struggled with myself, but heard from other people. And I think the first thing I think about when I think about how to answer that question is that there is no either or in the answer to that. There's no like either you have to be taking care of yourself or you have to be stuck in your horror and anguish. So the question is, where do you find balance? And, I think about my kids used to have this balance board. It was a toy that had a roller in the middle and a board on top. And in order to stay on that, you had to constantly be shifting your weight. And I think about that right now. Like, I need to constantly be shifting my weight. When I hear in the news about another person of color being murdered, when I see videos of people of color being murdered by people who look like me and who have the legal wherewithal to do it without getting, without being tried for it or arrested, it makes me horrified and worried for members of my own family who are Black and brown. However, it does not make me worried and horrified for my own personal safety. So I'm one step removed from the terror that I know other people live with. And I can either feel guilty about being one step removed, or I can step over that guilty place and think, how am I going to respond? And that's what I have to do, because not only do I need to do that for the people I love, but I need to do that for myself. I need to do that responding, because I would be less of a whole person if I ignore it.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you started talking about that, as those two are not our only options of anguish or balance. Because for me, it's about being present to what's happening so that I can do something with that, right? There's the internally, how do I pay attention to all the ways that my life gets to keep me separate from what's happening in our world? And just as you were talking about not having fear for your person, where I get to walk around with a level of safety and privilege every day of my life. But it's also, how does that mean I have to show up for my community? So for my neighbors, my colleagues, my family members, my friends who are holding those realities in a different way than I might be, and how does that impact our relationship and how I show up? I also think about it in that it's because of my capacity to retreat in privilege and your capacity to retreat in privilege and millions of Americans, white Americans' capacity to retreat into privilege, that this keeps happening, right? And so for me, balance is not about like, do I feel good every day? It's about, am I living my life in a way that is starting to shift fundamentally our collective balance, right? And that's, as a Quaker, that's what I feel like my call is to do, is to shift that balance, that God doesn't want us to live in a world where we treat each other like this and where this is the reality. And so one of the ways that we get to change that is by choosing to live our lives differently. I work out at the Y, and I'm often one of the only white people in the room. And it was on like 3 different screens constantly, and everybody was just working out because we'd already seen it so many times. And I thought, oh, this is not right. Both, we're not honoring him by having to tune it out. Nobody should have to watch a murder while they're exercising. And it made me think about in the early part of the 20th century when there were lynchings and white people would get dressed up and take their kids and like make a day of it. And you could buy these postcards. And I had this moment where, while I hadn't signed up to go watch his murder, there I was on the elliptical watching his murder. And I was like, oh, that hasn't changed. We're still commodifying these deaths in a way. And so what I decided to do just around the murders that happen, and this is ridiculous that I'm even saying this because they happen so frequently, is to watch them once in honor of the person who was murdered, to then watch what their family and their community is asking, and then do something about what their family or community is asking to do, as well as making sure that all the white spaces I inhabit are paying attention and talking about it and talking about what's our part in that murder, so that I'm not repeatedly just watching horror and feeling paralyzed and stuck and what do I do, nor am I denying it. And so for me, it's like that process of witnessing and feeling, listening to what the call to action is, and then responding in all the different ways that I have the opportunity to respond. And to me, there is some balance in that, because to ignore it is not balanced either, but the constant stream is not healthy either. So there's like this in-between place of how do we honor and acknowledge without getting sucked into. But the part for me really has to be about, so what's the movement then? What's my part?
And I think one of the things that I think about is how responding is complicated, not only for me when I respond, but also because other people respond to my response in different ways. So here in Cambridge and in towns around us here, a lot of white people have been doing standouts where they stand on the main thoroughfares at what, like whatever's left of rush hour right now, with signs that say things like Black Lives Matter. And I know that they are doing that as a response in solidarity with Black and brown people. I have heard from some of my white friends and colleagues how good it feels to them to be doing that and to be in community and to have some really tangible thing they can do to support people. I have heard from a couple of Black and brown people I know how re-triggering that is, how they're just trying to drive somewhere and they have to like be pulled back into a moment of pain and grief and anguish because there are people standing with signs saying, say their names, or with listing all the names of people who have been murdered. I don't know what the answer is there. I don't think it means people should stop doing the things they're doing to respond. I do think it means that for me as a white person to hear that the things that other white people and I are doing as gestures of solidarity don't always land the way we thought they would or that we hoped they would. I think that's really important. I think for me, it's about the cost of living with constant trauma, which many people live with for a variety of reasons. And because a lot of us respond to trauma by trying to hide it, ignore it, erase it, and in general not talk about it or acknowledge it, I think it's easy to not assume other people are living with it, and therefore to forget to think about that impact when we're doing whatever we're doing to respond.
Yeah, and that's why I really try to listen for what is a community group that I'm attached to, what is a family of someone who has been murdered, what are the things that people are asking for. So even if what I do is re-triggering to somebody else, because I'll never know fully what is or isn't, am I doing something that has been asked for? Because I think so often, particularly for me, when I was really starting to understand first about race and racism, and I was early on in my journey, I would want to show that I had learned something. So a lot of my initial actions were about me demonstrating my new awareness or me demonstrating my understanding. And almost always that landed with Black, Indigenous folks of color is like, cool, it's about you still, Lisa, right? And not what we asked for. And so really learning how to listen for what is being asked of me and how can I respond to that versus let me respond from a place that just makes me feel good or lets me show off kind of what I now learn or know or understand. And then I find when I listen for what's really the ask, I both have to pay more attention and often I get to develop deeper relationships because I'm responding to what somebody has actually asked for versus my perception of that or my being cared about, my perception of myself with them.
Right. And I think that's part of letting people of color take the lead rather than assuming that this big enthusiastic group of white people that you're a part of knows what to do without that piece.
And I think the other piece, because one thing I've heard over and over again is like, go work with your people or go get your people or take care of your own stuff. So when I also think about this notion of a balanced life, and I think about all the ways of self-care that I have access to because of the privilege and wealth my family was able to amass over generations here, right? Education, housing, wealth, social connections. I think about like, all right, if I really think about the notion of balance, what do I want to teach my child you need for balance? How do I want to live in a way that is starting to undo that amassing of privilege and do some redistribution of it? And is also about what's the generational work my generation, your generation has to do so that we're making structural changes. Mm-hmm. And for me, rarely does standing on a street corner lead to a structural change. Like there are ways that can be a great thing. And again, I'm not denigrating that, but when I think about positions of leadership I have, boards I sit on, those are places where I can make real structural change that doesn't have the immediate quick fix of like, I get to feel great because I did something, it's a multi-year process, but those are also the level of changes we need to be making and doing and taking action on.
Right. And I'm also really aware of the fact that there are plenty of people who identify as white who don't sit on boards and don't have the kind of power to by themselves change structures. And there is, in my opinion, so much work to do to change the world. So I just want to be careful that we don't leave people with a message that that you have to have some kind of power already in the world to make those kinds of changes, right?
Right. And I appreciate that because, right, I'm talking about places where I've got institutional power and then there's levels of personal power, right? So that's the conversations I'm having with my white friends when we're having meals together in front of our kids, right? Because that's not a norm. White people, we haven't been brought up to talk about our own racial identity explicitly with our kids, and this is what it means. I think about spaces where any of us, whether it's church or work or school, like how are we actively making our spaces that are safer for everybody, whether it's along lines of race or class or sexual orientation or gender, where we may not be able to change the policy because we might not be in a boss or managerial position, but who we invite to sit at our lunch table with us in the break room, who we are talking to, how we're acknowledging things. So I also think about what are the soft ways that we can make change that might not change the structure on paper, but change the feel of a structure or an institution and how we're engaging with it.
And I want to highlight one of the things you said, which is conversations that you have, say, around the dinner table. So one of the things I know from the work I do around racial equity with educators and families is that a lot of people who feel themselves to be in the majority, either in terms of race or in terms of gender or in terms of sexual orientation, see themselves as normal and other people as having identities. So one of the things I think of as part of the work is starting to really push yourself to talk about identity with your peers and with your children. Like, how do you know you're straight, right? Like, what does it mean to be white? How do you know your whatever gender you identify as? Because those questions um, those are questions other people are asking themselves. And so if you're not becoming conversant in those topics, then you're actually losing something. And as people who identify in the majority in any particular identity, it's not always clear that you've lost something until we are pretty far down the road.
Yeah, right. And I've done workshops for years where I asked people how many of us as young people had someone explicitly talk with us about what it meant to be white. And I think one time out of literally
Mhm.
hundreds has anyone raised their hand, right? And so I'm not doing that with my son. I'm not doing that with his generation, because I think of all the things I had to learn as a young adult that often I learned at the expense of my friends of color who were willing to step in and have those conversations with me. And that's not the person I want to be sending out from my house into the world, right? I want my child aware of who he is, understanding that, not just for his personal relationships, but also so that he carries himself differently and he understands all those things I had to learn, when I was 18, 19, 20, that he now knows as an 11-year-old because we can talk about it explicitly. And it also means too, part of what I hear in this balance question, for those of us that are parenting young kids right now, right, is what do we tell them? What do we not tell them? And again, where I've got the privilege where I don't have to sit down and have a conversation with my son about the cops if he gets pulled over when he starts driving. All those conversations that families of color have to have with their young people. So I try to think about what is the equivalent conversation, knowing that there's never a full equivalent, for how I prepare my son to enter those spaces. Right. So he knows when he's out bike riding with his friends pre-COVID, that if the cops ever stop them, he was supposed to talk first. Right. And sort of take the attention because he's going to be seen as the least targeted by the police potentially, and how and where he can understand his social role and how we have that conversation now before things happen. And so I do tell him about what's going on in the world. I don't show him a lot of images, but it's important to me that he also understands what's happening in our nation right now, and talking about that.
And I will say that as the parent of somebody who is a boy who is white and a boy who is black, I was really aware when they were growing up of wanting both of my kids to hear that, all those conversations, the conversations about like what happens if a cop stops you as a black person, and also who are you going to be as an adult so that you are not the white person who stops the black person because you assume that they're doing something wrong right from the get-go. So it's an interesting role to parent anybody. It's a particularly interesting role to parent young people of different races than you are. And, both of my kids are grown now, and I don't fully know how all of those conversations have played out in their lives, but I do know that my white son has a much clearer sense of who he is as a white man and what is his role with regard to people of color in his life than I think he would have had he grown up in some context where he didn't have to have all those conversations. And I don't think he loved all those conversations every moment that we were having them.
So one of the other questions, we've touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to go a little deeper into it, was how do I listen to and acknowledge the experiences of people of color when they share experiences I haven't had?
Yeah, I've heard that question a number of times, and it always puzzles me a little bit because I think, well, you just believe them, like it's not really hard. But I think that asking that question points to one aspect of white racial identity that is totally invisible to white people who are kind of like sucked into it, which is that we get to name the truth all the time. So if it didn't happen to us, it didn't happen, right? And at the very least, if it didn't happen to us, we get to question whether it happened. And I just think it's really important to let go of that because we aren't universal. Our experiences aren't universal, and we can't know what we don't know, but we can certainly know there are things we don't know. And how are we going to learn about them if we don't listen to other people and then believe what they say?
Yeah, I also think about it when I think about all the experiences I get to hear about that are not ones I've had. Like, I've never been married. People tell me about their weddings all the time. That doesn't feel like a stretch for me to be present to those, right? Or when people talk about jobs they do that are radically different than mine. And so part of it, I think, is this block that as white people we can have of like, that is this weird outgrowth of white supremacy, of like this total exotification of Black, Indigenous people of color, and like, oh, you've got some other lived experience I can't possibly understand, but I'm supposed to, and we like do these like mental head tricks versus like, you're a person in front of me sharing something, like, let me just be present for that. And so if the story they tell me makes me feel really sad, anytime I've ever said, wow, I feel so sad hearing that, that's usually an affirmative statement that I've heard you, what you've shared has elicited an emotion in me. And so anytime I've ever said that makes me feel really sad or I feel really angry, I've never had anybody say, well, don't say that to me. It's actually been a point of, versus when I say like, I can't believe that, or I don't think that's really what happened, which I think gets to your notion.
Are you sure?
It's unbelievable. Like, no, it happens every day, right? Which is just like, this is my truth and your reality is somehow other. And one of the things that I had to unlearn, right, because white supremacy cuts us off at our heads, was, and I grew up in a house where you just didn't show a lot of feelings. Like, it was okay to be happy, but mostly you didn't show a lot of other feelings. And so when I've had friends tell me really horrific stories of things they've survived, I would kind of go to that like frozen place, which I don't think made them feel very affirmed or seen or supported in those moments. And so, right. And then there's this whole thing about like white women's tears and don't suck all the emotional energy and turn it on me. But I found when I could just be present with what I was feeling, with what somebody was sharing, and say, you know, when you talked about this, like, I got really scared, or I got really tight, or I feel sick after hearing that story, and then give them space to talk more. I'm being present with them. I'm feeling what I'm feeling, but I'm not turning the conversation onto myself. I'm not expecting caregiving for my emotions. I'm not doing a lot of those patterns that, particularly as a white woman, I was taught to do in those moments. And so I think that listening, acknowledging is just that. It's listening, and then it's saying what we experience and hear is a way of affirming the truth someone has just shared with us.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other questions that I have gotten frequently in the last couple of months is, which is related, I think, to the first question, how do I stay in the work, right? And I think partly that's a question about how do I, there's so much coming at us, like how do we keep focused on race work, right? And partly maybe it's going back to that question of balance in one's life. But I wonder if you have any thoughts specifically about staying in the work.
Yeah. So I don't think it's a choice, right? I think it's what we have to do. And when I frame it as it's what we have to do, to me, on a religious level, on a spiritual level, on a human level, on a survival level, then it's about how do I do it in a way that is sustainable? Because if I'm frying myself out doing something, that's not going to serve anybody. And so I think about, right, the way that movements work. There's education and awareness. There's direct service. There's protests. There's advocacy and policy change. There's behavior change. And I think about like, all right, I can't do all those things all the time, but what can I do right now? So, you know, I went through a period where both my parents were incredibly sick and my mom was passing away. I couldn't do a lot, but I was like, okay, I can read, I can be learning, I can be shifting my own awareness in what I'm thinking, and I can occasionally send off a letter or call a representative kind of on the advocacy piece. Now that I've got some more space in my life, I think about, I can do more teaching and workshops. I have times for videos like this. And there are many, many calls that Black Lives Matter, that the Poor People's Campaign, that different groups are asking for from us, that are about showing up, that are about doing that advocacy work, that are about having these conversations with each other. And so how do I do those? But to me, I want to make it part and parcel of my life, right? That we got here because for generations, my family and many other white families didn't talk about race, didn't talk about white supremacy, didn't do things to interrupt it, and instead benefited from it. And if we're going to make that change, how do I orient my life in a way that that's central, in the same way that having care for young people and having care for the environment has to be central in my life if the next generation is going to be able to flourish. And so it's about both, to me, a reorientation, and then looking about what is being asked of us right now and what's the piece that I can do authentically and fully and sustainably. And then how do I kind of keep deepening that so I don't get comfortable in the same way that, like, when you exercise, you're like, cool, I can do 20 reps now, let me stop there. You're like, no, let me move to 25, let me move to 30. And what would have been really challenging for me 15 years ago is just not now. So that means I'm also building that muscle and that capacity. What about you? What are things that help you stay in the work?
I think that exercise metaphor is a really good one. So I think taking a sort of inventory every now and then of like where I am in the work is really useful for me. And I will also say that this is my work. Racial equity is my work in the world. So it's a little different for me because I feel like in order for me to be useful in this work, I have to keep learning and I have to keep growing. And I think that that is a little bit different than what might motivate other white people. But I will say that one thing you just talked about having care for young people and care for the environment and care for racial equity, to me, they're all the same. You can't have care for the environment without care for racial equity or without care for young people, right? So they're not just related, they are all the same work. And I really also value what you said about the different types of activism. I think that was all your 5 fingers there. No one can ever do all those things at the same time. And some of those things, some people can never do, right? And that's fine. We're in a period right now where if I can't do it on Zoom, or I can't do it outside with my mask on 6 feet away from everybody else, I can't do it. And so it means that I haven't been going to protests, which when I was younger, that was a big piece of what I felt like I had to do as a white person, was show up, right? So I really struggled with that earlier on in this pandemic when I just had to acknowledge that I couldn't put my body in places that I would have ordinarily. And so it made me stop and think about when I was much younger and I was going to protests, what were the people who were a lot older than me doing that was helpful? And how could I be one of those people? And so things I could do, I could help feed people. I could help people pay for transportation and housing. I could offer supplies and a place on my porch to make signs. I mean, there are definitely other things that I can be doing that are useful and helpful, and all of those are just one stream, one example, but that's what comes to mind at the moment. So I guess for me, it's about always coming back to like, where am I now in the work, and where do I want to grow? Where do I need to grow, and how am I going to grow?
Yeah. And, as you were saying that racial justice, climate justice, care for our young people are all the same thing. I find that anytime I do any of that kind of work, right, and I was a teacher for many, many years, so spent lots of time with teenagers, I also get to reclaim a little bit of my humanity. And so that it's not just about like this doing for somebody else and, oh, here, let me go help you. It is both like, what is our collective healing we need to do? And whenever I step in to do healing with anybody, I get healing as part of it, right? And I think that goes back to, if we can't leave the house, if we don't have extra resources right now, material resources, that work of conversation, of being with each other, of staying in there with each other, whether it's having care for Black, Indigenous people of color in our life, whether it's engaging with other white people around what it means to be white, that is part of the work, and that is doing it. And one of the exercises I used to do with my teenagers a lot when I was teaching media literacy as part of my history course was I just got them to pay attention for 24 hours of everything they were taking in, and then break down like, what were the messages about race, messages about gender, messages about class, sexual orientation, all of it. And so I even, going back to our first question around balance, like there's a lot of time right now where I just want to check out before I go to bed. And I love to read, and I'll read just about anything. But I make a point to say, okay, if I want to go read some sci-fi escapist novel, let me choose an author of color I haven't read yet before, right? So here I am, like the book I just finished the other night is by a Nigerian American author. And, you know, there's multiple aliens, it's way futuristic. And because of who she is, it's this incredible metaphor about colonization, resistance, liberation, how you carry on your culture and be with other people. That's not the work, but it also means in checking out in the evening, I'm reading something else that is going to actually help me expand and think more fully about how we do this work, and read from a culture and perspective that I was not brought up with. And so I also think about like the little things for when we need to step back for a moment of how do we keep our worldview opening, and how do we keep this notion of other experiences and perspectives present for us.
And I think that really, that goes back to that question of what do I do? So there are so many opportunities now to expand our worldview and understanding without putting the burden on people of color and Indigenous people who didn't ask us to put that burden on them, right? So you don't have to have the conversation about how you are wondering how your friend who lives down the hall is feeling about all the murders of Black and brown people this year, because you can go to YouTube or to social media or to the library or any number of other places and find resources by people who intentionally put them out there for your education. And no matter where you live, no matter how white the town you live in is, no matter how far away from a big city you're living, you have access to all of that for your own use. And I think it is part of the work. I think that even what you do for pleasure, even what you do for relaxation before you fall asleep, it's still part of the work.
Yeah, and I think too, then when I have read a book or watched a video or read some posting that has moved me, has helped me see something new, then the next piece for me is like, how do I honor that offering with tangible action? It doesn't have to be that moment, but that to me is the balance of it. Because I think one of the other patterns we as white people can fall into is think that like, I read the book, therefore I've done the work, versus I've read the book, therefore I'm more prepared to do the work, or I'm moving in my work. That there's got to be some notion of kind of motion for me with it. It doesn't have to be every single minute, because that's not sustainable, but the both and of that, right? How does this understanding I have shape what I'm going out and doing now, or how I'm showing up with people differently? And I think that's the other place where we as white people can step in and talk with each other. Like, cool, so you went to that workshop. how is that shaping up how you're doing differently now? You know, how can I support you in that? What can I learn from that? And where instead of just doing a thing we can often do of like, yay, you're so great, you did that thing, or yay, I'm so great, I did this thing, like, let's engage with it and move with it. What are we doing differently now? What are we doing more now? How is this shaping this? And so instead of just holding each other to account, being present with each other in what that activates and moves for us.
Right. And I think that's useful. So separating what's the interior work and what's the exterior work. And for me, there can be something of a lag time. Like I do the interior work and it takes a while for me to digest that and make it show up in a more exterior way. And it doesn't mean I'm not doing the work when it doesn't show necessarily. But you're right, having other white people who I can talk about it with and who can ask me, like, how's it going and what are you doing, is really critical.
So thanks for joining us in this video. We would love to get more questions, and you can email them to us at lisa@neym.org, and we'll put that address in the link below.
Thank you. And we hope to record more of these conversations, so it will be really useful if you send us some questions.
Bye.